December 7, 1941, 10:30 a.m. Above Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida circled his Nakajima B-5N bomber over the smoking ruins of the American Pacific Fleet, surveying the destruction below. Black smoke rose from the shattered remains of the USS Arizona. The USS Oklahoma had capsized, its hull gleaming in the morning sun. The USS West Virginia was settling into the harbor mud. Fuchida counted the damaged battleships. 8. All 8 American battleships stationed at Pearl Harbor had been hit. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt a growing unease. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The massive fuel storage tanks on the hillside overlooking the harbor stood untouched, intact, undamaged. Each tank contained thousands of barrels of oil. Without them, the American fleet could not operate, and they had not fired a single bomb at them. Fuchida looked east, toward the empty carrier berths. The intelligence report had been wrong. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. They were somewhere in the Pacific, hunting. Within hours, as Japanese pilots landed on their carriers and intelligence officers compiled damage assessments, a terrifying realization spread through the fleet. They had struck a devastating blow. They had sunk battleships and killed thousands, but they had failed to destroy what mattered most. This is the story of the most successful military surprise attack in history that contained the seeds of its own failure. A story of how Japanese pilots celebrated a victory while unknowingly ensuring their ultimate defeat. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not a sudden impulse. It was the culmination of months of meticulous planning by some of Japan's finest military minds. The architect was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and one of the most brilliant naval strategists of his generation. Yamamoto understood something that many of his colleagues in the Japanese military did not. He understood America. He had studied at Harvard University in the 1920s. He had traveled across the United States. He had seen the industrial cities, the oil fields, the factories. He knew what America was capable of producing once fully mobilized for war. Yamamoto opposed going to war with the United States. In memory, it could say America is the big field in the United States. Cripple American naval power in the Pacific for at least 2 years. Give Japan time to conquer Southeast Asia, secure oil and raw materials, and establish a defensive perimeter so strong that the Americans would conclude that reconquest was impossible. It was a plan built on perfect execution and enemy paralysis. It required that everything go right, and it required that the Americans react exactly as predicted. The planning was extraordinary in its detail. Japanese intelligence officers studied Pearl Harbor for months. They analyzed photographs taken by spies. They studied the harbor's depth, the anchorage patterns, the location of fuel tanks, repair facilities, and ammunition dumps. They identified primary targets, battleships, secondary targets, aircraft carriers, tertiary targets, cruisers and destroyers. The fuel tanks and repair facilities were noted but not prioritized. This would prove to be a catastrophic oversight. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida was selected to lead the attack. He was 39 years old, a veteran pilot with years of combat experience in China. He was known for his precision and his ability to coordinate complex aerial operations. In November 1941, he gathered his pilots and told them, "We have been given the opportunity to change history. The success of our entire strategy depends on what we accomplish in the first hour. We must be perfect. There is no room for error. We will surprise the enemy. We will destroy their fleet. We will win this war before it truly begins." The Japanese strike force departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, escorted by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. In total, 414 aircraft would participate in the attack, 183 in the first wave, 171 in the second wave. The force maintained strict radio silence as it crossed the North Pacific. The seas were rough. The weather was miserable. The pilots were nervous. They knew they were sailing toward either glory or death. On the evening of December, pre-dawn sky, bombers, torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters. They formed up in the darkness and turned south toward Oahu. The pilots flew in silence, knowing that the next 2 hours would determine the course of the war. At 7:40 a.m., Fuchida saw the northern coast of Oahu appear through the clouds. There was no sign of alarm. No American fighters rose to intercept. The surprise was complete. Fuchida transmitted the code signal, "Tora, Tora, Tora," "Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." The attack had begun. December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m. Pearl Harbor. The first bombs fell on Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, destroying American aircraft on the ground. Pilots who had been eating breakfast or sleeping in Sunday morning quarters ran outside to see Japanese aircraft strafing their airfields. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey, officer of the day at Naval Air Station Ford Island, watched a Japanese plane fly past his window and thought it was a very realistic drill. Then he saw the rising sun painted on the fuselage. He grabbed a radio and transmitted, "Air raid, Pearl Harbor. This is not drill." The torpedo bombers struck first. Commander Fuchida watched from above as his torpedo planes descended to 50 feet above the water and released their weapons. The torpedoes were specially modified with wooden fins to operate in Pearl Harbor's shallow water, a technical achievement that American experts had considered impossible. The torpedoes ran straight and true. At 7:57 a.m., the first torpedo struck the USS Oklahoma. Then another, then 3 more. The Oklahoma began listing to port. Within 12 minutes, the ship capsized, trapping over 400 men inside. The USS West Virginia was hit by 6 torpedoes in rapid succession. The ship began sinking immediately. Captain Mervyn Benyon was struck by shrapnel and mortally wounded. Sailors scrambled to close watertight doors and prevent the ship from capsizing like the Oklahoma. They succeeded. The West Virginia settled upright into the harbor mud, saving hundreds of lives. But the ship was out of the war. At 8:06 a.m., California sinking, Nevada attempting to escape but run aground, Tennessee and Maryland damaged but afloat, Pennsylvania in dry dock and hit by bombs. 8 battleships, all neutralized. The primary mission was accomplished. But as the smoke cleared slightly, Fuchida saw something that troubled him. The carrier berths were empty. He could see them clearly now. Empty. The intelligence reports had been wrong. The American carriers were not in port. Somewhere in the Pacific, 3 American aircraft carriers remained operational and undamaged. This was not part of the plan. Flight Officer Zenji Abe was flying a dive bomber in the second wave. His target was supposed to be an aircraft carrier. Instead, he was directed to attack already damaged battleships. Years later, he would describe his confusion. "We had trained for months to attack carriers. Carriers were the priority, the new technology, the new threat. But when we arrived, there were no carriers, only battleships that were already burning. I dropped my bomb on a battleship that was clearly sinking. It seemed like a waste. I remember thinking, where are their carriers? Why were we not told they were absent? Did our commanders know? If they knew, why did we proceed with the attack?" These questions haunted me later, much later, when I understood what we had failed to do. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. Both waves had struck and withdrawn. The Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers. Fuchida was the last to leave, circling the harbor one final time to assess the damage. As he turned north toward the fleet, he looked down at Pearl Harbor one last time. Through the smoke, he saw the massive fuel tank farm on the hillside, white cylindrical tanks, dozens of them, each one marked with numbers indicating capacity. Untouched. Not a single bomb had hit them. He had not ordered any aircraft to attack them. They were not on the primary target list. At that moment, Fuchida felt a cold uncertainty. Had they hit the right targets? December 7, 1941, 1 p.m. Aboard the carrier Akagi. The Japanese strike force was withdrawing north at maximum speed. Aircraft had been recovered. Damage reports were compiled. Pilot debriefings were Fuchida added, "Admiral, the American carriers were not in port. All three are at sea. Location unknown. Also, we did not attack the fuel storage tanks or the ship repair facilities. They remain intact and operational." Nagumo's expression changed. He asked about a third strike. Some of Fuchida's pilots had been advocating for a third wave to hit the missed targets: the fuel tanks, the repair facilities, the submarine base. Nagumo considered it. Then he refused. His reasoning was sound from a tactical perspective. The element of surprise was lost. American forces were now on full alert. American carriers were somewhere nearby, possibly preparing a counterattack. A third strike would mean launching aircraft in daylight, finding targets in heavy smoke, and recovering aircraft while potentially under attack from American bombers. The risk was too high. The primary mission had been accomplished. Nagumo ordered the fleet to withdraw. No third strike would be launched. Fuchida argued. He knew they have trouble. He thought they activate in the same thing. He was follow as a prot. Fuchida argued anything, the FD-1 of surprised. It will be a litterbiff to the third strike. On others, it's worst. He determined for 5 years of this word. He even liked that country that launching aircraft with must-havely argued. He knew they had missed critical targets. But he was a commander of aircraft, not of the fleet. Nagumo's decision was final. The Japanese strike force turned north and sailed for home. The pilots celebrated. They had won a great victory. They did not yet understand what they had failed to destroy. Back in Japan, initial reports of the attack were greeted with euphoria. Radio broadcasts announced that the American Pacific Fleet had been destroyed. Citizens celebrated in the streets. Military officers congratulated each other. The war had begun with a stunning success. But in the Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto did not celebrate. He read the damage reports carefully. 8 battleships hit. Good. But 3 carriers escaped. Fuel tanks intact. Repair facilities undamaged. His face betrayed no emotion, but his staff noticed he seemed troubled. Yamamoto's chief of staff asked if he was pleased with the results. Yamamoto replied, "We have won a great tactical victory, but I fear we have made a strategic mistake. The Americans are now united against us. Their carriers are instead united the American public behind a war that Japan could not win if it lasted more than a year." December 8, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Immigration. The thermostat day after the attack, American damage control teams were already at work. The scene was apocalyptic. The harbor was covered in oil. Bodies floated in the water. Ships were still burning. Rescue crews worked desperately to cut through the capsized hull of the USS Oklahoma, knowing that men were trapped inside. Over 400 sailors were entombed in the Oklahoma. Rescue teams could hear them banging on the hull. They worked for 2 days and saved 32 men. The rest drowned as the air inside the ship ran out. But even amid the horror, American commanders were assessing what had not been destroyed. Captain Homer Wallen, the Pacific Fleet's salvage officer, walked through the base and made notes. The submarine base was intact. The repair facilities were intact. The massive 1010 dock, one of the largest dry docks in the Pacific, was slightly damaged but repairable. The fuel tanks were untouched. Wallen realized something that would change the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. Most of these ships could be salvaged. The USS Nevada had been hit by torpedoes and bombs, but had managed to get underway during the attack. The crew had attempted to escape the harbor, but was ordered to beach the ship to prevent it from sinking in the harbor channel and blocking access. The Nevada was beached and would be refloated, repaired, and returned to service. The USS California had sunk in shallow water, but was sitting upright. It could be raised. The USS West Virginia was also in shallow water and could be salvaged. Even the USS Oklahoma, capsized and seemingly destroyed, could theoretically be righted and rebuilt. Within days, Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived to take command of the Pacific Fleet. He walked among the wreckage and asked what could be saved. Wallen told him 6 of the 8 battleships could be returned to service. Nimitz looked at the fuel tanks on the hillside and asked why they hadn't been destroyed. No one had a good answer. The Japanese had simply not targeted them. Nimitz calculated quickly. Those tanks held 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil. The USS Nevada was refloated in February 1942 and returned to service by December 1942. The USS Tennessee and USS Maryland were repaired quickly and returned to combat in 1942. Even the USS Oklahoma was righted in a massive salvage operation that took 2 years, though the ship was too damaged to return to combat. USS Arizona and USS Utah could not be salvaged. They remain in Pearl Harbor to this day, underwater memorials to the men who died aboard them. But 6 out of 8 battleships returned to fight. The Japanese had achieved devastating visual damage while failing to inflict permanent strategic damage. The Americans had been hurt, but they had not been crippled. The fuel tanks became a subject of intense analysis. Why hadn't the Japanese destroyed them? Japanese after-action reports show that the fuel tanks were identified as a potential target, but were not included in the priority list. The planners believed that destroying battleships was sufficient to cripple the Pacific Fleet. They underestimated how quickly Americans could repair battle damage. They underestimated American industrial capacity. They underestimated American determination. Most critically, they failed to understand that modern naval warfare was about logistics as much as combat power. Lieutenant Commander Suguru Suzuki was an intelligence officer in the Combined Fleet headquarters. In the days after Pearl Harbor, he compiled reports from pilots and analyzed reconnaissance photographs. He wrote in his personal journal, discovered after the war, December 12, 1941, reviewing photographs from Pearl Harbor attack. Disturbed by what I see. Yes, many ships damaged, but fuel tanks untouched, repair facilities untouched, submarine base untouched. More concerning, no carriers. All 3 American carriers escaped. I raised concern with superior officers, was told not to dampen celebration mood. But I am troubled. We planned this attack for months. How did we miss the carriers? Why did we not target fuel? These questions have no good answers. I fear we have celebrated too early. Suzumtion City's concerns were prescient, but they were ignored in the euphoria of victory. December 10, 1941, Tokyo. Admiral Yamamoto received a complete intelligence assessment of the Pearl Harbor attack. The spoke. Gentlemen, we have won a battle. The Americans are now united against us in a way they were not before. Their President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. Congress voted with only 1 dissenting vote. 1. The entire American nation is now committed to our destruction. We have not destroyed their ability to fight. We have only ensured that they will fight with every resource they possess. Their carriers are intact, their fuel is intact, their shipyards are intact. Within 6 months, they will have more carriers than we do. Within a year, they will outnumber us in every category. We needed to force them to negotiate peace. Instead, we have guaranteed a long war, and in a long war, we cannot win." The room was silent. Yamamoto's staff understood that their commander was right, but no one wanted to admit it. They had just achieved the greatest military surprise in Japanese history. They had struck the Americans in their home port. They had sunk 8 battleships. How could this be called a strategic failure? But Yamamoto understood what the others did not yet grasp. Modern warfare was not about individual battles. It was about industrial capacity, resources, and sustained production. Japan had limited oil, limited steel, and limited industrial capacity. America had nearly unlimited resources and the world's largest industrial economy. Time favored America. Every day the war continued, America grew stronger and Japan grew weaker. Yamamoto knew the mathematics. In 1941, American steel production was 8 times greater than Japanese steel production. American oil production was 700 times greater. America could build ships faster than Japan could sink them. America could train pilots faster than Japan could shoot them down. The only way Japan could win was to force a quick peace before American industry fully mobilized. Pearl Harbor had been designed to accomplish this, but it had failed. The Americans were not seeking peace. They were seeking revenge. Firefox Flight Officer Zenji Abe returned to Japan in late December 1941. He was celebrated as a hero. He had participated in the Great Attack. He received medals and commendations. But in private conversations with fellow pilots, he expressed doubts. "We failed in the one thing that mattered most, forcing America out of the war before American industry could be brought to bear." January 1942. Pearl Harbor. Then even optimists had dared toy was faster than even optimistic estimates had predicted. Salvage operations continued around the clock. Ships were being raised, repaired, and prepared to return to service. The fuel tanks, untouched by Japanese bombs, supplied the entire recovery operation. Ships could refuel at Pearl Harbor. They did not need to sail to California. This single fact changed everything. The aircraft carriers that had escaped the attack became the foundation of American strategy. Admiral Nimitz understood that battleships, while impressive, were not the future of naval warfare. Carriers were the future, and he had 3. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga became the core of American offensive operations. Within weeks of the Pearl Harbor attack, these carriers began launching raids against Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. The raids were pinpricks. They did not inflict serious damage, but they sent a message. America was still in the fight. On April 18, 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The Doolittle raid, named for its commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, inflicted minimal physical damage, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's military leadership had promised the Japanese people that their home islands were safe from attack. That promise had been shattered. American bombers had struck the capital. The raid was only possible because American carriers had survived Pearl Harbor and because American ships could refuel at Pearl Harbor rather than sailing back to California. Admiral Yamamoto understood the implications. The carriers he had failed to sink were now attacking Japanese positions. He needed to destroy them. He began planning an operation to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle. The target would be Midway Island. The date would be June 1942. The result would validate every fear Yamamoto had expressed after Pearl Harbor. Midway fought recovering from an appendectomy and could not fly. He watched from the flight deck as American bombs struck his ship. The Akagi burned and had to be scuttled. Fuchida was transferred to a destroyer and survived. Years later, he would write, "Midway was our punishment for the mistakes we made at Pearl Harbor. We had 6 months of success, exactly as Admiral Yamamoto predicted. After that, we could not match American production, American resources, or American determination. Everything after Midway was a slow retreat toward inevitable defeat. If we had destroyed the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, Midway would never have happened. If we had destroyed the fuel and repair facilities, the Americans could not have recovered so quickly. We made critical errors. We paid for them with 4 carriers and the war." Unmistaked, June 1943. Zenji Abe's final mission. Menstrual Officer Zenji Abe survived the battles of 1942. He flew combat missions throughout the Pacific, watching as Japan's position slowly deteriorated. By mid-1943, the Americans were advancing. Japanese forces were retreating. The carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were at the bottom of the Pacific. New American carriers were joining the fleet faster than Japan could build replacements. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. But they kept fighting because surrender was not considered an option. On June 16, 1943, Abe was ordered to fly a reconnaissance mission over American positions near Guadalcanal. He took off from Rabaul in a Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter. He never returned. American records show that a Japanese Zero was shot down that day by F-4F Wildcat fighters from the USS Saratoga. The Saratoga was one of the carriers that had escaped Pearl Harbor. Abe was killed by the very ships he had failed to destroy 18 months earlier. Before that final mission, Abe had written a letter to his younger brother. The letter was found in his belongings after he failed to return. It read, "We are losing this war, not because we are not brave, not because we do not fight hard. We fight with unlimited determination and unlimited resources. The war would continue for 2 more years. Millions more would die. Cities would be destroyed. 2 atomic bombs would be dropped. But the outcome was determined in December 1941 when Japanese pilots celebrated sinking battleships while missing the targets that actually mattered." A sign, August 15, 1945, Japan surrenders. Stabilize. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did not live to see Japan's surrender. He was killed on April 18, 1943, when American P-38 fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville. American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese communications and knew his exact flight path. It was a targeted assassination. Yamamoto's death was a major blow to Japanese morale. He had been the architect of Pearl Harbor. He had warned that Japan could not win a long war. He had been right. His death came almost exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, a raid that was only possible because American carriers had survived Pearl Harbor. PEM Detone Toei Fuchida survived the war. He was in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, on a military assignment. He had left the city the day before the atomic bomb was dropped. He returned 2 days later and witnessed the devastation. The experience transformed him. After the war, Fuchida became a Christian missionary and peace advocate. He traveled to the United States and met with American veterans, including some who had survived Pearl Harbor. He spoke at churches and schools about reconciliation and peace. Smashing, combating. In 1952, Fuchida published his memoir. The book included his assessment of Pearl Harbor. "We achieved tactical surprise and inflicted heavy damage, But we failed in our strategic objective. We did not destroy the American will to fight. We did not destroy American capability. We left intact the very things that would enable their recovery: carriers, fuel, repair facilities. Within 6 months, the Americans had recovered and were on the offensive. Within a year, we were retreating. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a perfect execution of a flawed strategy. We won the battle and lost the war. Affles. Tsuchida's assessment became the consensus view among historians. Pearl bomber pilot could have hit them, but they were not on the target list. The Japanese planners had prioritized battleships. Battleships were impressive. Battleships were symbols of naval power. But in modern warfare, logistics mattered more than symbols. Fuel mattered more than battleships. Repair capacity mattered more than single-day damage totals. The Japanese had focused on creating an impressive visual spectacle while missing the targets that actually mattered for strategic success. Captain Homer Wallen, who had overseen the salvage operations at Pearl Harbor, wrote in 1968, "The Japanese could have won the war at Pearl Harbor, not by sinking more battleships, by destroying our fuel and our repair facilities. If they had hit those targets, the Pacific Fleet would have been forced to withdraw to the West Coast. Hawaii would have been indefensible. The entire course of the war would have changed." But they didn't. They focused on the wrong targets. They won a spectacular tactical victory that had no strategic value. History is full of such mistakes. Pearl Harbor is just the most famous example. September today, Pearl Harbor is remembered as a day of infamy, as President Roosevelt called it. For Americans, it is a symbol of the surprise attack that brought the United States into World War II. For Japanese historians, it is remembered as a tactical success that contained the seeds of strategic defeat. The battleships that were sunk have become memorials. The USS Arizona remains submerged in Pearl Harbor, a tomb for 1,177 sailors. Over 1.8 million people visit the memorial every year. But the real legacy of Pearl Harbor is not in the ships that were sunk. It is in the targets that were missed. The 3 aircraft carriers that escaped would form the core of American offensive operations for the first year of the war. The fuel tanks that were never bombed would supply the entire Pacific Fleet throughout the war. The repair facilities that were left intact would rebuild the damaged ships and turn Pearl Harbor into the most productive naval repair base in the Pacific. Within 3 years of the attack, all 6 battleships that could be salvaged had returned to combat. The USS West Virginia was present at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. The Japanese naval officers who survived the war were asked repeatedly about Pearl Harbor. What would they have done differently? The answer was always the same: destroy the fuel, destroy the repair facilities, and find the carriers. Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, who had been chief of staff to Admiral Nagumo during the Pearl Harbor attack, said in a 1964 interview, "We should have launched a third strike. We should have ignored the risk and destroyed the fuel tanks and repair facilities. We should have searched harder for the American carriers. Our caution cost us the war. We had the opportunity to cripple the American Pacific Fleet for years. We settled for crippling it for months." In war, caution at the moment of maximum advantage is often more dangerous than audacity. We were cautious. We withdrew. We celebrated. And we lost. The generation of American sailors who survived Pearl Harbor never forgot what they experienced that Sunday morning. But many also remembered what happened after. They remembered the salvage operations. They remembered the repairs. They remembered returning damaged ships to service. They remembered the fuel that kept the fleet operating. Captain John Crawford, who was a junior officer aboard the USS California on December 7, 1941, said in 1991, "We thought we had lost everything that day. The ship sank beneath us. Men died all around us. It looked like the end of the world. But within months, we were raising the ship. Within 2 years, we were back in combat. The Japanese sank us in 1941. We sank them in 1944. That's the lesson of Pearl Harbor. They hurt us badly, but they didn't destroy us. And that made all the difference. Unsetting cider. The strategic lessons of Pearl Harbor have been studied by military academies worldwide. The attack is taught as an example of how tactical success does not guarantee strategic success. It is taught as an example of how missing critical targets can nullify tactical achievements. It is taught as an example of how assumptions about enemy behavior can lead to catastrophic miscalculation. The Japanese assumed that sinking battleships would cripple American morale and force negotiation. They were wrong. The Japanese assumed that a massive surprise attack would cause America to accept Japanese expansion in Asia. They were wrong. The Japanese assumed that America's courage, sacrifice, and transformation